On May 14, 2008, the Swanson family home in Marshall, Minnesota, was quiet. Brandon Swanson, just 19 years old, was wrapping up another semester at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, about 30 miles away. He was studying wind energy, a young man with plans in motion, a career path set in one of Minnesota's growing industries. Friends and family described him as responsible, focused, and not the kind of person to take unnecessary risks. That night, after finishing his classes, Brandon decided to join some friends for a small gathering in Canby. It wasn't a raucous party by any stretch. According to reports, there was some drinking, but Brandon wasn't intoxicated. He remained in control, alert, and capable of driving. Around midnight, he said his goodbyes and got into his car, a Chevrolet Lumina, planning to head back to his hometown of Marshall, where his parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, were asleep. The roads Brandon traveled that night weren't highways. This was rural Minnesota, farmland stretching endlessly in every direction, with scattered gravel roads connecting small towns and fields. For someone unfamiliar with the area, or even for locals driving late at night, the roads could be confusing. A wrong turn could send you miles out of the way without realizing it. At some point after leaving Canby, Brandon drove off the main road and onto a narrow gravel stretch near Lind, a tiny town about 7 miles southwest of Marshall. In the darkness, perhaps misjudging the shoulder or swerving slightly, his car slipped into a ditch. The car wasn't damaged, and Brandon wasn't injured, but the Lumina was stuck, its wheels spinning helplessly in the loose soil. It wasn't a catastrophic moment, but it was frustrating. Brandon was a teenager, alone at night, stranded on a back road with few options. He did what any young man with a cell phone would do in 2008. He called his parents for help. At around midnight, the phone rang in the Swanson household. Brian and Annette answered to hear their son's voice, calm but annoyed. Brandon explained that his car had slid off the road and he needed a ride. He assured them it wasn't an emergency. He was fine, the car was fine, but he couldn't get it out of the ditch on his own. His parents agreed to get him. Brandon told them he believed he was near the town of Lind, so Brian and Annette got into their car and drove toward the area. The plan was simple: find Brandon, pick him up, and return in the morning to deal with the stuck Lumina. But the simple plan quickly unraveled. As the Swansons drove up and down the gravel roads near Lind, they saw nothing. No stranded car, no headlights, no sign of Brandon at all. They called him again, and he insisted he was exactly where he said, near Lind, just off the road. Brandon even flashed his headlights repeatedly, hoping his parents would see him. But no matter where they drove, nothing appeared. It was as if Brandon were describing a place that didn't exist. The frustration grew. Brandon, on the phone with his parents the entire time, couldn't understand why they weren't finding him. To him, his directions made perfect sense. To Brian and Annette, the night was becoming a maze of wrong turns and empty roads. As the minutes stretched into nearly an hour, Brandon finally decided he wouldn't just sit in the car. He told his parents he could see the lights of a nearby town, which he believed to be Lind, and that he would walk toward them. If they couldn't find his car, perhaps they could meet him in town instead. Brian and Annette agreed, still on the phone with their son as they tried to navigate where he might be. Brandon described his surroundings as he walked: fields, fences, and distant lights on the horizon. The spring night was cool, but not bitterly cold, and Brandon seemed determined to reach safety. At this stage, neither Brandon nor his parents had any sense that something was about to go terribly wrong. It was just a frustrating miscommunication, a search that wasn't lining up. They expected to meet him in Lind within minutes. But those minutes stretched on, and the small problem of a car in a ditch was about to become a nightmare that has haunted Minnesota for over a decade. You're watching Trace of Evil, where we reveal true crimes, unsolved disappearances, and mysteries surrounding crime. Like and subscribe to watch more episodes from our channel. Let's get back into the story of Brandon Swanson. When Brandon left his stranded car and started walking, the plan seemed logical. If his parents couldn't locate the Lumina, he would simply meet them in town. From his vantage point, he believed the distant glow of lights was Lind, the small community he had mentioned earlier. He stayed on the phone with his father, Brian, as he walked, the connection acting as both reassurance and a guide through the dark Minnesota fields. The time was nearing 2 a.m. Brandon's voice was steady, not panicked. He described fences he was crossing, fields he was walking through, and roads he thought he recognized. To his parents, driving around in frustration, his descriptions only deepened the mystery. Nothing matched. The longer the conversation went on, the clearer it became that Brandon was not anywhere near Lind at all. Still, the call continued. Brandon spoke to Brian for nearly 47 minutes straight. During that time, he never suggested that he was in immediate danger. He was irritated that they couldn't find each other, tired from the day, but not afraid. He kept insisting he was making progress, heading toward the lights he could see in the distance. Brian encouraged him, hoping the walk would soon lead them together. Then the tone of the call changed. At some point after 2:15 a.m., Brandon's calm voice shifted. He suddenly exclaimed, "Oh, shit!" Words that were sharp, startled, and filled with urgency. It was the last clear thing his father ever heard him say. After that, the line remained open, but silence filled the connection. No footsteps, no breathing, no rustling of clothes. Nothing but a dead, empty call that lingered until finally disconnecting. Brian shouted his son's name over and over, but there was no response. For a moment, Brian and Annette thought it might be a dropped call, a simple service issue. Rural Minnesota had plenty of dead zones, and Brandon had already been walking through isolated farmland. But when repeated attempts to call him back failed, the weight of something much darker settled over them. By dawn, the Swansons contacted law enforcement and reported their son missing. Brandon had vanished in the middle of a phone call with his father, less than 10 miles from his own home, in an area where searchers should have been able to find him quickly. Yet there was no trace. The initial investigation turned its focus to Brandon's car. Authorities located the Lumina exactly where he had said it would be, but not in Lind. Instead, it was discovered near Taunton, a rural area about 25 miles from where Brandon believed he was. The miscalculation explained why his parents had failed to find him, but it also raised new questions. How had Brandon gotten so far off course, and why hadn't he realized his true location? Search efforts began immediately, with teams combing the fields, ditches, and roads near where the car was found. K-9 units were brought in, and at first there was hope. Dogs picked up Brandon's scent trail from the car and followed it through fields and along fences, exactly as he had described during his call. The trail eventually led to the Yellow Medicine River, a shallow but unpredictable waterway cutting across the farmland. Here, the dogs lost their scent. This discovery sparked the first of many theories. Some believed Brandon had attempted to cross the river in the dark, slipped, and drowned. Others pointed out that the river was shallow in most places and that no body was ever recovered despite repeated searches of the water. The possibility of foul play or a sudden accident unrelated to the river could not be ruled out. The final words Brandon spoke to his father, "Oh shit," became the chilling centerpiece of the case. What had he seen or experienced in that split second before the line went silent? Was it a misstep, a fall, a sudden threat, or something else entirely? For the Swanson family, the unanswered questions were unbearable. Brian, who had been on the phone when his son disappeared, carried the memory of that call like a weight he could never set down. He replayed it in his mind endlessly, convinced that whatever happened in that moment was the key to understanding Brandon's fate. The official search expanded in the days that followed. Hundreds of volunteers, police officers, and professional search teams covered the surrounding miles. Aerial searches were conducted, rivers were dragged, and farmland was scoured. Yet nothing, no clothing, no phone, no personal belongings was ever found. Brandon had seemingly vanished into the empty Minnesota fields. The case was unusual from the start. Missing persons cases involving teenagers often involved runaway scenarios, substance use, or clear signs of foul play. But Brandon didn't fit any of those patterns. He was a responsible student, with no history of disappearing or running from problems. He had been sober enough to drive, coherent enough to maintain a long phone conversation, and communicative until the very last second. His disappearance made no sense, and with each passing day, the mystery deepened. By the end of the first week, the number of searchers had swelled into the hundreds. Deputies, state investigators, volunteer firefighters, and townspeople combed the fields. Search dogs were deployed again, and helicopters swept the area with infrared cameras. Every farmstead, drainage ditch, and roadside was checked. It was exhaustive work, yet the silence was deafening. No phone, no wallet, no clothing, no remains. Also, by the end of the first week, the Swansons faced an agonizing truth. The last words they had heard from their son might also be the last anyone would ever hear. Authorities struggled with the sheer openness of the terrain. Unlike a dense forest or a remote mountain, the farmland of southwestern Minnesota offered no natural hiding places. A body, a backpack, even a single shoe should have been visible during such an extensive operation. The fact that nothing was found only fueled speculation. One of the most persistent theories was that Brandon had slipped into the Yellow Medicine River and drowned. This idea had weight, since the scent trail from the dogs had ended near the water. But when the river was dragged repeatedly with professional equipment, no trace of him was recovered. The river, while capable of hiding someone briefly, was neither wide nor deep enough to permanently conceal a body, especially after multiple searches across seasons. Another theory was disorientation. Brandon had been walking in complete darkness, across uneven farmland, with only the faint glow of distant town lights to guide him. Perhaps he had stumbled into a culvert or collapsed unseen in a field. But the problem was scale. A human body, even if obscured by tall grass or hidden by terrain, rarely evades detection forever, not when hundreds of people are looking. As weeks turned into months, the absence of evidence began to trouble investigators. Foul play, while not the most obvious explanation, could not be dismissed. Brandon had been on the phone until the very end, and his abrupt exclamation, "Oh, shit," remained a chilling anomaly. Had he encountered someone in the darkness? Had another vehicle stopped along the road, leading to a confrontation? In a rural area with little traffic, it wasn't impossible. Yet, there were no witnesses, no signs of a struggle, and no reports of suspicious activity in the area that night. For Brandon's family, the lack of answers deepened their torment. His parents, Brian and Annette, were active in the search from the very beginning. They worked closely with law enforcement, pressed for additional resources, and coordinated volunteer efforts. They held onto the hope that each new sweep would bring a breakthrough. But every fruitless search drove home the same devastating truth. Brandon was gone without a trace. By the one-year mark, the case had gained statewide attention. Local newspapers ran anniversary stories, highlighting the unanswered questions and the family's unrelenting grief. The public began offering theories of their own. Some suggested Brandon might have been the victim of a hidden well, sinkhole, or abandoned farm structure, hazards that dotted the rural landscape. Others theorized he might have wandered far beyond the original search zone, into a place where investigators hadn't thought to look. Technology, too, raised questions. Brandon's cell phone had been in use until the abrupt end of the call, but the triangulated data placed him near Taunton, miles from where he thought he was. Why had his sense of direction failed him so profoundly? And why, after all the years of searching, had not a single piece of evidence, even a fragment, been recovered? Theories hardened into camps. Some believed Brandon drowned in the river that first night. Others were convinced foul play was involved. Still others thought he collapsed in exhaustion or injury somewhere unseen, and his remains had somehow been overlooked. The lack of closure fueled every possibility. Despite the theories, investigators never abandoned the case. Each spring and summer, when the fields were clear and the rivers low, new searches were conducted. Every effort ended the same way, with no sign of Brandon. The weight of this mystery soon extended beyond the Swanson family. Law enforcement officers admitted frustration at the lack of progress. Volunteers who had walked miles of fields spoke of the haunting emptiness, the strange sensation of looking for something that didn't seem to exist. The case became a reminder of how a person could vanish in plain sight, a reminder that was unsettling in its ordinariness. For the Swansons, life was divided into before and after May 14, 2008. Their home became a place of constant waiting, the unanswered phone call echoing in their minds. They knew their son had not chosen to disappear. Something had happened that night, something final, and yet the earth itself refused to give up the truth. By the second year, the disappearance of Brandon Swanson had crossed into something larger than a local case. It was becoming a mystery with national reach, studied by true crime communities and missing persons organizations across the country. Yet, at its core, it remained what it had always been. A family waiting for answers, staring across empty fields where their son had once walked under the pale glow of distant town lights. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson is not just a story of a young man who went missing in rural Minnesota. It became something more enduring, a case that reshaped state law, haunted a community, and highlighted how fragile the line is between ordinary life and sudden tragedy. For Brian and Annette Swanson, the days after Brandon vanished stretched into months, and then into years. Each spring thaw brought a return of search teams to the Yellow Medicine River and the surrounding fields, each with renewed hope that evidence would finally appear. Time and again, those hopes were dashed. Nothing surfaced. No clothing, no remains, not even a shoe or a scrap of fabric. Brandon's absence remained absolute, yet his voice lingered. The memory of his final phone call became the family's last tether to him. His father, Brian, carried the unbearable burden of having heard his son vanish in real time. The sudden exclamation, "Oh, shit," played in his memory like an unending loop. It was the final line of a story that never reached its resolution. The case forced the Swansons into an unwanted spotlight. They spoke with law enforcement, reporters, and community groups, not simply to keep Brandon's story alive, but to push for change. At the time of Brandon's disappearance, Minnesota law enforcement agencies were not uniformly required to take missing adult cases seriously in the first 24 hours. Adults, unlike children, had the legal right to disappear if they chose. Too often, families were told to wait before an official investigation could begin. The Swansons knew that Brandon had not walked away voluntarily. Their son had been in distress, on the phone with his father, when he vanished. Waiting was not an option, and they argued that no other family should face such uncertainty in the critical hours after a disappearance. Out of this conviction came Brandon's Law. Passed in 2009, just 1 year after he vanished, the legislation required Minnesota law enforcement to promptly respond to reports of missing adults, regardless of age, mental health, or voluntary disappearance. Agencies were mandated to begin immediate searches and share information across jurisdictions. Brandon's absence had exposed a dangerous gap in procedure, and the law sought to close it. His name, forever tied to tragedy, was also tied to reform. For the wider community, the case became a haunting lesson. In a region where roads stretch endlessly and the land feels familiar, the thought that someone could vanish so close to home was unsettling. Farmers, volunteers, and townspeople who joined the searches spoke of the eerie stillness of those fields. They had scoured the land where Brandon's scent trail ended, some returning year after year, hoping the earth would finally yield an answer. It never did. As the years passed, theories hardened but answers remained elusive. Some investigators still leaned toward the river theory, believing Brandon had fallen into the water under cover of darkness and drowned. Others noted that repeated searches of the river produced nothing, not a trace, and doubted the explanation. A smaller number continued to whisper about foul play, about the possibility that someone had crossed Brandon's path that night. But there were no suspects, no reports of strangers, no evidence at all. Theories multiplied, but certainty never followed. The case also resonated far beyond Minnesota. In true crime circles, Brandon's disappearance became a study in how someone could vanish in the most ordinary of settings. Unlike cases involving remote mountains, dense forests, or vast deserts, Brandon disappeared in farmland, near towns, within cell phone range, and on the line with his father. If someone could vanish here in plain sight, then perhaps it could happen anywhere. For Brian and Annette, the years of waiting brought both exhaustion and resolve. They continued to honor their son's memory, speaking publicly about the importance of early searches and the pain of unanswered loss. They raised awareness not only about Brandon's story, but about the countless families still waiting for answers in their own missing persons cases. By the 10th anniversary in 2018, Brandon's case had become both a mystery and a legacy. The Swansons marked the occasion not with closure, but with remembrance. There were still no remains, no belongings, no final word. But there was Brandon's law helping other families in their darkest hours. In the absence of answers, that legacy became a form of survival. The story of Brandon Swanson remains suspended in time. A 19-year-old student, stranded on a gravel road, spoke calmly to his father as he walked toward the glow of a town's lights, a voice steady until the very end, when fear broke through with 2 words that left his family haunted forever. A case that offered no resolution, but demanded change. Today, the fields near Taunton look much as they did on the night Brandon disappeared. The river runs shallow in places, quiet and unassuming. Town lights still glow faintly in the distance, just as they did when Brandon believed they would lead him to safety. The landscape has not changed, but the story that unfolded there lingers as a wound that never healed. For his parents, for his community, and for all those who study unsolved mysteries, Brandon Swanson is not just another missing person. He is a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can fracture into the extraordinary, how silence can follow a voice, and how a life can vanish into the night without leaving a trace.